Welcome to the RHINO Man podcast. I'm John Jerko, your host, and one of the directors of RHINO Man the movie. This podcast series is a way for me to interview top conservationists on the topics of rhinos, the poaching crisis, the importance of rangers, and community engagement, all as a way to create awareness around these issues and to promote the coming release of the documentary film. In this episode, I have a wide-ranging conversation with my good friend Ashwell Glasson. Ash is a combating wildlife crime policy specialist and registrar at the Southern African Wildlife College. He's an executive board member of the Field Guides Association of Southern Africa. He's worked as a field guide, was a medic in the South African Defense Force, and has degrees in peace studies and conflict resolution and strategic business management. The list goes on, and we cover much of Ash's education and employment background in the first part of this podcast. But it's not just a boring list of accomplishments. It's infused with stories about the history of South Africa and the complex problems and potential solutions surrounding the current poaching crisis. There are plenty of stories and much to take away from this conversation, so let's jump in. Welcome to the show, Ash. It's so great to have you. Really appreciate you being on the RHINO Man podcast. Where are you at and how's things on your side?
Well, thanks very much, John. It is steamy, 32 degrees here, centigrade. So it's pretty hot, and we're into the middle of an awesome summer. The La Nina has come by, so the period of drought that we had over the last couple of years has really slowed down. So we've had good rains, lots of impala lambs have popped out, and the predators on the move, and the park is looking really good. The woodland kingfishers, for those of you who are into birds, you can check those out online, are in full call. And funny enough, now they're not calling that because you'd probably be able to hear them in the background. Sitting at home at the Wildlife College campus, and obviously the beginning of a good new year, hopefully for everybody, and particularly for conservation. So, yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, those woodland kingfishers, I got to know them pretty well, especially being there trying to shoot films and interviews. When they come into town, it's hard to get a quiet moment at all.
Exactly. They're going on the whole time now. I mean, for birders and bush people in Africa, it's just, that's the summer vibe. You kind of just know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So with this conversation, I definitely want to dig into kind of your area of expertise and knowledge around wildlife crime, poaching. I mean, you're way high up in Fagasa, but this is the first episode of the RHINO Man podcast. And I thought it's really special to bring you on because when this film RHINO Man got started, you and Anel were a huge part of helping us logistically manage some of our shoots down there. And I met you in 2018. First time I was ever in South Africa. We did a wild 2-week shoot. It was our last shoot for the film project. And I think it was the first night I stayed at the Wildlife College at your guys' place. You guys set up these beautiful cots for us and laid down. I was jet lagged and tired. And I just remember going into this crazy dream where all of a sudden I felt like I was falling through space. And then I just hit this hard surface and realized that the cot somehow blew apart. And I ended up on the cement floor of the place and ended up sleeping on a yoga mat for the rest of the night. But
oh boy!
Besides that, it was an amazing experience, and yeah, you showed us a great time. My first game drive ever was with you, so I really appreciate that. It was an amazing experience to get out there in nature, and it's, I've always been someone that loves the woods and getting out. When I was young, we lived in a pretty rural area in Northeast Ohio, but there's something different about being out in the bush in Africa and that energy and possibility and danger and all the things that kind of go into it. That it's a beautiful experience and really connects you to nature. So yeah, really thank you for all those experiences. And 2020, which is a whole nother story, it spent 9 months down there and had a lot of great times with you. So yeah, it's been a wonderful getting to know you. And on top of being an amazing friend and a hilarious person to chat with, I just realized, man, this guy is like one of the smartest people I've ever met, and super passionate about what you do. So kind of taking that, I know it's, sometimes awkward to brag about yourself a little bit, and I may do like an introduction with some more details, but To the best of your ability, could you kind of give some background on your experience, how you kind of managed to bridge all of these different areas of expertise together, between just kind of looking at some of the things that you posted online, like insurgency, war, security, wildlife crime, policy author, environments, growing people, like all these things that you've managed to bring together. Like what type of life experience did it take to make that happen?
Wow, it's a great question, and thanks for that and the intro. And yeah, those were fun times, and there'll definitely be fun times ahead. So yeah, I think many people when they're younger, particularly like your teenage phase, you get under the typical pressure maybe from parents. I'm 48, so I come from a slightly older generation where there was pressure to kind of make up your mind about a career. And in that time, obviously, South Africa was still in the throes of apartheid, but heading towards the end of it. So it was a really mind-blowing, and when I say mind-blowing time, we as the youth then realized that there was a lot of change. And some of that change, as usual in life, you've got no control over it. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but the one interest that I had, that was kind of a childhood thing fostered by my grandfather, and like many young birders, somebody in the family introduces you to it, and you either take to it or maybe frustrates you because of the patience of a child is not necessarily the kind of thing that you take to. But I did take to it and really loved it, and it kind of simmered over the years, even into high school. I kind of was doing my birding trips and long hikes and going into remoter, wilder parts of South Africa and Southern Africa, the bigger region, and just enjoying it. And I mean, obviously, birding can be in itself pretty relenting and very focused. And in that process, I realized, that there was something about the bush and birding, and it kind of left a mark on me. It wasn't enough, though, having said that, to kind of make an instant decision. So after school, in our standard 8, or what's our grade 10, I got my enlistment kind of warning, because national service was kind of a thing still then. And they kind of let you know at 16. They know where you are, what school you're at. And by the time you're 18 and finish school, you either go to university or college, or you have to enlist.
Sorry to interrupt, Ash, but was that for everyone at that time?
Yes. Yeah. Well, all white males of the age of 18 and over, which is obviously tied to the whole apartheid kind of state at the time. So it was South Africa was a very militarized society, particularly in the 1980s. We were fighting in Angola, and kind of, without overdoing it, was a bit of a proxy war as well. So all of that Cold War stuff, we were actually part of it. And South Africa has the dubious history, or it depends how you view it, as fighting the longest insurgency in the world. So when America pulled out last year of Afghanistan, it was 1 year away from our record of fighting in the Bush War. So South Africa was front and center in the Southern African region for all sorts of reasons, many of them bad, obviously, negative, in terms of the politics of the time and the racial issues and ethnic issues that had arrived out of that kind of supremacist ideology at the time. So I went to the military in 92. I kind of fulfilled my call-up requirements, and I spent a full year in training and being operational, and then some additional time as we were heading into the first democratic elections. So I kind of found myself in the military going, oh, this is a bit weird. I loved the bush training, what we would call the bush phase, which is your rural infantry type training. And that kind of also ticked some boxes for me in another way as well, which influenced my decision around the bush and conservation and everything. But one thing that the Army experience did teach me, particularly as a combat medic, was the issues around humanity. It's a paradoxical role. You're trained to kill, legitimately in a sense as a soldier, but you're also there to heal and help and support. And yeah, I obviously saw lots of things in our South African townships, primarily that didn't sit so well with me. And those kind of experiences also influenced not so much my politics, but just my personal life view of this common humanity. And that will be a theme, that I'll pick up on now. So after that, in about 96, I really was at a loss at what to do. I was working as a bartender. A friend of mine from the Army had also gotten out. He had a restaurant and I helped him out. And eventually I did another bush trip and it all clicked for me. At that moment crystallized. I thought, oh, I'd forgotten it. I was birding, doing my thing, and then I realized. And within 3 months of that, I went on a field guide course because I hadn't been to college yet, or varsity, university. So getting into conservation, there are various routes. You can do it via the very formal academic routes, study zoology, botany, or some kind of conservation related qualification degree and kind of enter in that way. And I wasn't ready for that. I'd kind of come out of a very military, wanted things to be a bit more practical and wanted to add value immediately. And yeah, within a few months of doing that course, I landed myself a job in a reserve not far from Pretoria and Johannesburg, worked there. And then by pure luck, I met another really good guide, field guide, ranger, and he kind of put my name forward to quite a well-known organization that operates lodges and reserves called And Beyond. And I went, and they have a selection process, which is kind of a mix of a paramilitary type of selection, fitness, and all of that character, leadership, personal skills, but mostly passion, communication, and the need or drive to actually want to give to conservation and do for conservation. And so that was a very practical way for me. Got through that and then worked at various reserves over the next 8 years of my life. And in that time, had amazing experiences, met amazing people, and grew so much as a person. And the And Beyond model, the way that they do things, connects conservation with common humanity. They try and link it to bring wilderness and people together in a way, wild spaces, and not just the big five, lions, leopards, and buffalo and elephant and rhino together. It's about the bigger view and how you can contribute as a guide, taking people out, much like RHINO Man will do as a production, as a film, to influence people. And that role as a field guide and working with trackers and members of the community, I still maintain. I learned in my life more from a tracker than I did in formal education, just field skills. Not that it's not science, or, there is actually, that's both an art and a science, but all of that kind of came together. And I had a wonderful time, worked with some wonderful people that are still in the industry, still giving, still concerned. We were kind of on the edge of the beginning of the climate crisis, and poaching of rhino and those kind of things was a good 10 years away. The elephant poaching crisis had kind of settled a bit, and yeah, it was incredible. And I worked at places like Pinda, Bongani, Makalali. I also traveled a fair bit to eventually start training other guides and trackers and other reserves, because that's kind of eventually, now getting back to your question, now how did you tie all these things in? It was the passion for people, the passion for wildlife, and choosing to help kind of be an interface. So the guiding definitely helped with that. And of course, in the 5-star lodge environment, you meet incredible people. I was not a shy teenager, but I was quite reserved.
It's hard to believe, not knowing you now.
Yeah. So the experience, the skills, and what and beyond and provided in terms of experience, and more than anything, probably trust. They invested in trusting me, and I think that's kind of part of the message. That's a big topical issue for youth in the world right now, is trust, and how people invest in them and trust them, and trust them as people, as individual, as you. And I think that is one of the challenges, and we'll chat about a little bit later why the world is struggling a bit. It's not an us versus them thing. It's just, I think the world is in a bit of a trust deficit right now.
That's interesting.
Moving on from there, I went into training rangers full time, and then I got poached by a government agency in Johannesburg. I was heading into my early 30s, and then I got more into the formal policy environment and working on skills development and training issues for conservation. And then obviously included field rangers, the law enforcement component. So the field guiding thing just kind of exploded for me. The base, my conservation experience just grew. And to move into the policy development and advocacy space, which I think RHINO Man and GCC and the team do incredible work, is that upfront communication, being able to connect to people and then make that connection meaningful afterwards, and then get them to act upon that connection, to say, well, what are my options? How can I get involved? Who can I engage with? Can I do it from here? Can I do it from home? Actually, you know what? I'm going to make some life decisions and everything. And you can be that radical, or you could be a little bit more passive and think, actually, this is a cause I want to report. And that's what I learned also in government. Government is the same all across the world, whether you're in the federal or state level government in America, or like in South Africa, national government, or what we call provincial government, and everything. It's all the same. It's bureaucracy, and the challenge is to remain passionate, not get too tied up in administration. I mean, you need administration and accountability in a state, and that is one of the key issues right now in conservation, and particularly poaching, is the accountability around how do we address corruption in conservation that's underfunded, underpaid, under-resourced. So that creates a fertile ground for distrust and all of those kind of challenges. And you can try and cover that up with administration, bureaucracy for a while. And I think we've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in America and Brazil, the issues around the Amazon, and not necessarily just deforestation, but land use, and how things are kind of done through the administrative process, but not necessarily through creating connections through people. And conservation is really about that. It's about creating those connections.
I really want to jump into your perspective on especially the RHINO poaching issue and wildlife crime in general. Could you kind of take where you're at now, maybe give us, you've done so much education, which is kind of an amazing thing, and you're always learning and growing. Maybe just give us a brief background of what some of your education credentials are, and then we can lead into the current situation on the ground and how it kind of developed, especially for people, even me coming into this project for the film. It's I knew there was South Africa, there's rhinos, I've heard some stuff about poaching, but until you get there on the ground, it's really hard to understand what's going on. And it's still always a learning process. So yeah, I don't know if you can make those steps, just kind of connect your education, because I think it'll be interesting to hear what you've studied and where that's leading you to. And then we can jump into more of the current situation and how that's developed.
Yeah. So with my education, I take it as being fit for purpose. So yeah, I kind of what I call maybe a scholar, practitioner, or professional. in conservation and lately more on the law enforcement kind of aspects. But I eventually made the decision to go and study full-time. In 2010, I moved to Cape Town. I was working for a brown industry type environmental consultancy, and they kind of supported me being able to study full-time, even though it was at a distance. So I was still attending study blocks, and I was commuting between Johannesburg and Potchefstroom, a tiny town where Northwest University is, and Cape Town, and kind of doing a range of studying, work. And it was a crazy 3-4 years of my undergraduate degree and everything. It was mad. And that was in human resource development. So I decided, okay, let me stick as a university education. Let me stick with my strengths of people and working with people and encouraging people. And so it's a bit of a combination of industrial psychology, adult education, and that reflects a lot of what I do now at the Wildlife College and other projects that I'm involved in. So that was kind of a big break, and I did really well. So blow my trumpet a bit. In my third year, I was the best student in the entire education faculty. So quite a lot older. So I showed up the youngsters a bit. They were, I went to the prize ceremony, and it was funny. There were a whole lot of young people, and there were about 3 or 4 older ones. And I didn't say we take the top prizes, but I took, the number 1 prize.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So that was it. It was an incredible experience, and also kind of finally brought me into the more formal academic world. On the other side, I'd done the field guide training. Obviously I built on my military weapons training, the dangerous game, all of those kind of things, and went through the Field Guides Association of Southern Africa, and as well as and beyond's training to kind of get me all rounded. So I had the expertise in adult education and human resource development, and then the specialist expertise. And sometimes this is what's missed out at universities, that sometimes people don't add in skills-related training or short courses, and they think their degree is what will sort them out. Now, in terms of careers, now that's possible, particularly if you're doing the typical professions of engineers, dentists, doctors, lawyers, and so on. But conservation, and I think from your experience, is multidisciplinary. It requires a much more diverse way of framing and thinking about the issues. And that's what I undertook. I realized then, in about 2011, 2012, I had an epiphany and realized, no, don't only be on that trajectory. You have to have a bigger view. And the government experience, as much as people go, oh, working in government, it actually really helped, because you get exposed to the political principles. And when I say principles, the people, the politicians, and you kind of get to assess what they're looking for, what they need, what promises they've made, and then what's also realistic, being a public servant, realistic policy advice, and how you can try and educate them. Because most of the time, the civil servants themselves are the experts and not the politicians. And we know this. We know that generally the politicians very rarely do not come out of those portfolios. And so you've kind of got to help them along your way. So the connection and communication, and again, like with RHINO Man, to influence the formal decision-making guys and ladies, to get them to go, a penny has dropped now. I might not know much about conservation, but I can see the value in the connections as well. So that was a big thing. I then went on to, as the whole poaching thing started sinking in already in 2008 with the shift. And we've also got to take a step back, John. We've got to take a step back. 2007, stock market crash. The one country that showed a fair amount of resilience and actually grew and started really accelerating and already had great growth just before it was China. And so we realized that something was up, not just seeing the awfully graphic and violent ways that rhinos were being poached and killed and dehorned. But we realized even in terms of the local communities, things had shifted. Things are becoming criminalized. Now, South Africa's got a history of being a violent country. There's no doubt. You can't argue that point. And we're definitely up there with Brazil and a few other countries in the world. And not to scare people, but, we're only 27 years after democracy, a little bit longer now, that South Africa, right till the point of our first democratic elections, if I remember correctly, between 1984 and 1994, 20,500 people, I think that's the figure, our own citizens that were killed in the country due to the politics and everything at the time. So elections 94, 96, full constitutional democracy, and we kind of have moved on. And that is not something that's been fully addressed. So with those lenses and the way of thinking with wildlife crime and everything, it's not just a simple thing. There are various factors.
Yeah, a lot of history building up to it.
So history has played a role in it, continues to play a role in it.
I never made the connection of, I knew in 2008 around that time that the poaching started to spike, especially in rhinos, but it just never crossed my mind that, oh yeah, that's the year that, we were in this recession. And you mentioned China was doing well compared to everyone else, but South Africa, what was the status there?
It took a hit. So rhinos, there were some poached in the 1990s, but not nearly at the same levels. Sometimes it'd be 4 or 5 a year, but there was still a focus, luckily. But what seemed to happen is that, and not to kind of point fingers at Southeast Asian countries, but it's clear the statistics, the research, the following the trade seizures. When I say trade seizures, arrivals and port and customs in Vietnam, Thailand, all of those places are showing very clearly where the product is going. And that is also tied to the fact that China was a bit more resilient economically, and its middle class had grown to the point where demand was definitely starting to climb. And in South Africa, with the hit that we took and our low economic performance, unfortunately, which has been a perennial issue, people had to make choices. You can't take people out of the equation. And particularly if you think about rural folk who have spent their lives herding cattle, had a minimal education, which is a challenge in South Africa, and have skills. Not skills that are necessarily marketable in the formal private sector, but they know how to hunt, how to track, how to do all of these things. And so the demand started influencing the supply. There were people that could start supplying. And also around about the same time, the collapse of the 3 Asian rhino species was accelerating. So that whole scenario meant, well, like there's a lack of rhino to poach now in Southeast Asia and India and the related Nepal and Bhutan and all of that, they had to turn to Africa as well. So that was a key moment, that we were globalized enough. Social media had also taken off. So contacts through Facebook, and tech often leads ahead and the government kind of follows. So law enforcement has to catch up. But we know that the transnational criminal syndicates took advantage of it, expanded their footprint, and China was already in Africa.
So were they using social media platforms to kind of almost market the potential, like, we will pay you this much for rhino horns types of things?
Yeah, and it probably started with simple contacts. A Chinese immigrant sussing out, arriving in South Africa, maybe with a hidden agenda. We've got to say what it is: a criminal, typical front cover backstory stuff, similar to the narco stuff that happens along Central America as well as Mexico into the southern US. So the scene was set with those kind of things. And Chinese investment followed with Chinese and immigration into Africa because it's natural. You're going to put money into a country like Kenya, for example, or Tanzania, where they've built extensive railway networks. Some of their people will come through. So the RHINO became symbolic of an overall growth in explosion and wildlife crime. And the CITES statistics also show that massive pickup.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you remember the rough numbers of kind of where it started and what it went to?
Well, I mean, it kind of, RHINO poaching was as low as like 5 to 10 a year for quite a while. And I can send through some statistics. And then it just suddenly spiked, post 2008, when the situation socioeconomically in South Africa became quite dire. And now, to speak a little bit politically, also we went through a change of leadership with what we now call the Zuma years, the last 9 years of the Zuma presidency, and the resulting corruption and what I was talking about earlier, the accountability and corruption started to grow. So we know that there was penetration of transnational organized crime groups, whether they are dedicated Chinese or not, or just part of the value chain, or multiple groups coordinating. And it's in this gray area kind of zone. And they definitely got to a few politicians and started making things happen in terms of securing the supply chain. Mm-hmm. And that's when a big spike happened. And, like in my generation, many of us were kind of prepared, wow, okay. When I say prepared, the old skill sets, South African military, and you've seen it. There's a lot of ex-military and ex-police people in conservation, which in itself is not always a good thing because then the focus ends up just being on law enforcement. But we all started to ask ourselves the question. The demand issues is a multi-generational thing. How do we solve poaching and remembering poaching is only one component of the bigger wildlife crime and illegal wildlife trafficking issues. And it includes everything from plants to people wanting cycads and Madagascan chameleons and illegal forestry products and everything. Mm-hmm. And that peaked, and the RHINO became a symbol for all of these issues. So wait a minute, the RHINO is big, it can't be easy to poach, and etc. And then actually it turned out it was very easy to poach. And although people were prepared as individuals, it took, and on the scale, it's like, in America, and well, not so much America, but particularly Europe, their view of national parks and things like that is quite skewed versus ours. So the scale that we have to operate with the limited resources hits us immediately.
Can you dive into that a little bit? Because I mean, it's something, maybe if you're more engaged in actual, how these places are managed, you might have some context, but I think the average person, it's not even something you really think about, but just give a little bit of a scale of like what it takes to manage these spaces and what the resources are, because I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. So, in Europe, you can, for example, have, when I was in the Netherlands on a holiday, on a break, I went to one of their national parks, and I keep on forgetting. It was a national park that was 200 hectares, so that's just over 400 acres. Yeah. So I walked through it in half an hour, and I was birding and everything, and I thought, okay, so you don't need a lot for that, and because the country's a lot smaller than ours, distance is not such an issue. But in South Africa, land is still relatively open, and places like the Kruger and even in Mozambique and neighboring countries, parks start approaching a scale that is bigger than some of the European countries. So Kruger, the 2.2 million hectares, so nearly 4.5 million acres. And to put it into perspective, if you think about it in acres terms, there's nearly 500 field ranges in the Kruger for the size of 4.5 million. So you can figure out, so that's approximately just 1 point something statistically. Let's figure that out. 100,000 acres.
That sounds insane. Like,
yeah,
how's that even work?
Yeah. So that was the big thing. That was the big thing, is the ranges couldn't be everywhere at once. And unfortunately, it's still fairly true, although things have improved a lot, because the private reserves or privately owned reserves are part of the picture now, and there's a lot more cohesion. So that became phase two. Phase one, the Kruger tried to hit it hard on their own. They were coordinating and everything, but it was very tough, and there were losses rapidly. So there was a decision at cabinet level. Some politicians realized they need help. So a famous guy, a friend of mine and a colleague, a retired general, was brought in, General Johan Jooste, to kind of start looking at the options. And it was a choice, a decision. Going back to my point earlier, the demand side requires disruption. So we've got to disrupt the poaching networks as much as possible in the present, but we still have to address the social cultural issues that create the demand and consumerism. And I'm not saying I'm anti-consumerism and anti-capitalism and all of that stuff, but there's a very big difference between wanting to own a Gucci handbag that gets manufactured in their thousands from resources that are easily replaceable versus a limited number of animals. And you hear the arguments all the time. People say, well, what's different about it from worrying about eating beef or the number of cows and things? It's very different. There are millions of cows on the planet. There are now less than 30,000 RHINO, pretty much, and probably a lot less around. So it's not an apples and apples comparison. One has to be careful how you frame that. And I think that's also kind of been the issues is disrupt now, try and stop the poaching, try and address the transnational organized crime issues. And we know now that transnational organized crime is multi-product. The guys who are running drugs, they are human trafficking, the proliferation of light weapons, all of these things, the growth of piracy in the world, there's all sorts of connections. And even as America has encountered narco-terrorism and things like that. So you kind of realize that these organizations are quite potent. They get down to the local level, they make the connections, they have the resources, and they're able to act, which gets to the other point. We also realized in the first phase of the kind of law enforcement to paramilitary response that, and particularly for me, is that the communities are being left out. The communities where poachers are often drawn from, or where they criminalized. In other words, communities themselves were being left out of the solution set. And that took a while, because our fortress conservation, as we used to call it, and the history of it has been very colonial. It was a fence, people on the side, wildlife on the side, some people let in to enjoy it and pay for it and everything, which is great. Paying for conservation is great to support it, because it doesn't necessarily get the full financial support it needs from the state and everything. And then the private owned reserves, they generate their own income through selling safari experiences. So the whole system kind of came under threat, and people started realizing the communities. How can we get the communities on board to value wildlife and get them involved, and that there are jobs? And this kind of gets back to RHINO as well, is the social connections and opportunities for young rural folk to become field rangers, to grow into conservation, and hopefully even move beyond just the law enforcement bit to get involved in other elements of conservation, which is the research, the monitoring, the opportunities of what the wild spaces represent. And I mean, I'm kind of extending the conversation a bit, but we know like the Amazon and parts of South Africa and parts of Central Africa and other parts of the world are still biological reserves of things that could benefit humanity pharmacologically, like pharmaceutical research, cancer treatments. We might be destroying the very things that could be helping us medically, health-wise. And then obviously the big thing, like as a kid, and trying to bring this other connection is just the sense of wellness and peace that one can get connecting to nature and everything and spending time in nature. And I think you got great exposure to it. That's why we go on game drives, because there's a serious work in conservation and trying to save species, trying to save wild places, connect people to it in a meaningful way. And I think that's the key thing, because there's struggles in that. And I think RHINO Man will show a lot of that, what stories there are, the personal narratives, like just what it takes to be in conservation on the ground. And I think that's key.
I feel like you've really set up the picture, and there's so many kind of different aspects to go through here. I think the main ones I want to focus on are rangers, because I feel like you have a strong connection to that training and what's their purpose is, and also at the Wildlife College, their training program there for rangers, and then back into the communities as well. With GCC, a lot of the work now is kind of bridging that gap between communities and conservation. And I think, something that a lot of people don't know too is just, there's millions of people living along the border of Kruger National Park in the greater Kruger area, but many of these kids never get a chance to even experience wildlife firsthand. So that's a big part of it is, like you said, it's this healing aspect of it and being able to participate in it from that aspect. But if we can, let's dive into the rangers a little bit more, because like you said, from the military side, you can have a tendency to maybe hyper focus on the aspect of protecting and forget about the communities. But, I think there's also a more holistic way of looking at it as well. And I think, the Wildlife College is definitely, pushing for that perspective. But maybe just give us more detailed understanding of what a ranger does, what that looks like, because I think a lot of people think of guiding, field guides and things like that. But what's an actual field ranger? How's their job evolved since this poaching crisis has really taken off? And what's kind of their mission and how that connects to the kind of the greater mission of protecting these species?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, if we actually asked existing field rangers, maybe some who've been in the game for say 20 or 30 years, they'll kind of say, we used to do our patrols. We would occasionally have issues with snaring, which is obviously a form of trapping, and those kind of things. But a lot of their work was to support conservation, whether game counts, fixing roads, actually addressing conservation issues like maybe erosion in an area. And that could be for a whole lot of reasons. Because reality is most of South Africa anyway, and quite a few of the other parks in Southern Africa are managed. These are managed places. They've got wild spirits, really wild energy, but they do need work. Particularly, you put a fence around something, you're going to have to manage it. And so field rangers have kind of been part of the management tool. They've been part of the management system, assisting on all sorts of things. And their role wasn't necessarily purely about law enforcement. And maybe, I hate to use percentages, but maybe 30 or 40% of it was. The rest was really conservation work. They would go out with ecologists and things like that, go and identify trees, help do a transect, walk, help with doing a grass sample or something like that, vegetation surveys. And unfortunately, obviously, that's declined because poaching has grown. So field rangers have become much more law enforcement oriented. Their workload has switched right around. There's very little time for them to be doing that kind of thing now. And that raises, getting back to the holistic view, concerns. The concern is, whoa, what about those other important things in conservation other than law enforcement? And so we've got to be big enough, even those of us that have kind of a paramilitary kind of angle, you can see, well, we still got to take care of the animals, the ecosystems and those kind of things, and keep an eye on them, particularly in the era and the concern of climate change, issues of water. South Africa is a water scarce country. So there's a lot of other competing issues in the mix. So that's definitely a concern for many of us, is what the trade-off is for, and then maybe we won't see it now, but what is the trade-off for being very law enforcement oriented and not necessarily having time for the other things? And so, unlike in America, quite a few of the rangers at preserves and some of the natural monuments in America, they kind of, yes, they have a law enforcement role. They're often involved with tourism and that kind of thing. Our field rangers almost have nothing to do with tourism. They're essentially trained to patrol. They carry semi-automatic weapons. They are expected to work long hours, work shifts, kind of do proactive work in terms of looking, detecting incursions of poachers coming in, and also reacting when an actual event has happened, sadly, and kind of then following up, whether it's via aircraft, helicopters with canine capabilities, which has been a huge growth area. One thing that's happened in Africa in conservation is the return of the canine. Dogs and service dogs are now part of the mix, and it's happening all over because of the scale and distances. And got to be honest, the motivation of the poachers, these guys poach and then they run for their lives. In military terms, it's escape and evasion. And actually, we found that dogs, canines, are much better to the long, and particularly now, the summer conditions we have now, when poaching is happening, you actually need to get the dogs in. And obviously, just for the record, in South Africa, the dogs don't run the guys down and kill them. They're not trained to do that. It's purely a tracking, trailing function. Buying time for what we would call a cutoff group or a follow-on ranger flight to come in by a helicopter to effect an arrest. So that's a key thing for us. And that's what rangers are doing right now.
Could you go into a bit of what the wildlife college is doing and what their training, their ranger training is like? Because in RHINO Man, don't want to give much away in terms of the film, but we do follow a selection process, and maybe you can kind of explain what that is and how that leads into their training, and maybe why your training is different, better than some of these other organizations that are doing training as well. How do you guys kind of separate yourselves? I mean, you're a college on a bigger scale, like a university, versus I feel like other organizations are maybe more just focused on the security, but I feel like it kind of goes back to that holistic idea. What do you guys do differently? I know you're involved in some of the creation of some of the programming.
Yeah, so I think with RHINO Man, you get to such a visceral view. But interestingly, before we get into the detail of that, the field ranger training only came once the college realized that the Kruger National Park and others were starting to say, hey, we need law enforcement capable, ethical rangers to be trained. The demand grew. So the college kind of pretty much between 2010 to 2013, a bit before my time, then had to move into that space as a response for the demand to counter the poaching. to now start supplying field rangers that are well trained. And so Ruben de Kock, well known, one of the top ranger trainers in the country and even globally in a sense, was brought in and established the program. And he built that program on a paramilitary model. So it's both a selection process, like the military, you are tested physically, psychologically, and over that process, you experience a personal journey, very personal journey.
Could you talk a little more about that? Because I feel like, sometimes you run into people that are, they see this selection process and they say, this seems really hard on these guys. Why do we need to be this hard? And I feel like there's different reasoning behind it, but I know you've got your military experience and perspective as well. So how could you talk to that and why it's necessary to have such a physical experience to select the right people?
Yeah, one can critique it, and there is critique and criticism about the selection processes. But what we do know, and I mean, others might argue, and better qualified people, psychologists and etc., might argue my perspective. But selection processes put you under pressure, different forms of pressure. They also replicate the likely environment that you'll be operating in. So to put you in as an individual into what you probably will be encountering in the future if you're successful. Now, as much as people go, oh, the physical stuff and all of this PT and waking people up and, the sleep deprivation and all of that, at the end of the day, you have to ask, all of that can be overcome by one single thing, is your personal sense of motivation, your ability to push yourself beyond certain boundaries. And unfortunately, poaching and wildlife crime has pushed us in that direction. We're dealing with similarly motivated individuals as criminals. And you need similarly motivated people to be able to address that. You can't send in somebody who's just in it for a job. And so, without stealing thunder from RHINO Man, one of the hints I will put in, it's about motivation. Even if you don't complete everything successfully, you're being assessed the whole time. We're watching. We are seeing, okay, this person is pushing beyond their limits. We can back off a bit now. We can see their character and their belief, which leads into the next thing. The field ranger training is also about ethics and self-discipline and building a sense of cohesion. So like a typical military model, you come in as an individual and you might have various ways of thinking and doing all of that. And then you get forced into a scenario where you've got to cooperate, collaborate, work with people, build connections with people in your squad, your stick, whatever you want to call it, your patrol group. And I think that is key. We can only test that in a certain way, assess that in a certain way. And that's in those contexts. So a lot of people think it's all about individual success, individual drive. But a lot of the time, we have to be able to see, can this person work with another 3 people for maybe weeks on end with very limited contact with other human beings? And that's the nature of the wildlife crime environment right now. Guys and girls, and remember, we're also talking, there's a gender shift happening.
Yeah. I wanted to bring that up because unfortunately the selection we captured for RHINO Man was only men, but we do have a newer project we're working on as well. But there are a lot of women that go through this selection process and all the training and excel as well. So it's not, it's not discriminating against anyone really. It's, if you've got the drive and passion and, you have to have a certain level of physical fitness just because of what the job requires, but anyone can go into this role.
Well, that's it. That's it. It's all up to you. The point that you've made now is seminal because it's all up to you. If you want to get in, you'll push yourself if you truly want to. some people come in selection not really knowing what to expect. And yes, that's part of it because you kept off guard a bit. And yes, you do have to meet certain physical requirements. That is the reality because it has to reflect what it would be like to be an operator. So if you use military language, field rangers are field operators. They're very specialist. They have to, over time, develop their bush skills, their interpretation skills, their tracking capabilities, the firearm capabilities, musketry, and maintain a high level of motivation and teamwork, and then personal leadership and everything that goes into it. So that's the other side of it, is you can also identify amazing individuals who've got no clue that they've actually got that. So that's a beautiful thing when you see it come together. It's beautiful when you see this young person. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna kind of reiterate what you're saying. As I've watched a couple selections, you see that transformation from maybe, it's usually younger men and women that's, this might be the first time that they're really tested. And, for them to kind of realize like, I can do this and take ownership of the discipline aspect and see the value in it. And all of a sudden it's like, they just light up and there's nothing that's going to stop them. And it's pretty magical. You can kind of continue, but yeah, I just wanted to add to that as well.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, it's fantastic because they self-empower. That the situation, they're subjected to a situation, but they self-empower themselves, and that is also what draws the distinction from a lot of other positions or jobs and things like that. Is that the field rangers, the field ranger creed is really important, and then the big thing is that you don't need a university degree. You can come in, and it creates access, which kind of addresses that holistic view, is that we are also training rangers from the communities. By and large, that's where they come from. And I think that's what a lot of people kind of maybe sometimes, they get worried, well, maybe you're actually training the enemy. They use like war language. But you know what? You've got to take the chance. You've got to give, and like I was saying earlier, you've got to trust in the youth, particularly to take the opportunities. And for many of them, the field ranger training program, the selection process, and the follow-up program is probably their one opportunity to get a qualification of some kind and get access to an industry for all the right and wrong purposes is growing. It's growing because of poaching. We need field rangers out there, and ultimately what they go through, what they learn. And I mean, it's like any basic training course in the military. It's intense. You master things quite quickly. Some things you need help. You start building your social power with each other as individuals. And of course, you bring in things. You bring in your life story, where you come from, whatever community comes into it. And I think you touched on a very important point, is that it develops pride. And I'm not talking like in military terms of patriotism there, but pride for oneself. And I think, yes, it's a very competitive process. People can kind of have different views and everything, but it's kind of the gateway. And one of the big areas that we work on and try and encourage is the ethics bit of it, and the discipline bit of it. So they are taught to drill like in the military on the parade ground. They get daily PT. They attend theory-based classes. They get to spend time in the bush. And getting back to what you're talking about, some of these are the very kids who'd never been in the Kruger but live on the border. And then they go for a week and sleep in a tent and learn about the bush as a future field ranger. They learn about the wildlife. They get to experience what it's like to hear, whoa, there's a hyena calling in the riverbed next to us.
Yeah, I got to experience a bush week with a selection group as well. And most of these men and women have never been out in the bush, especially just walking around out there and, camping. And it's kind of another magical experience to watch. It's like, there's some moments where it's like, oh, is this thing going to attack me? Hyenas are coming around the camp, or but also just like these super special moments of connecting with nature. So I want to kind of close the ranger side of it and move more onto the community side, and to bridge that, a little story with one of the main characters we're following is Anton Zimba, who's the sergeant at Timbavati Private Nature Reserve. And he's one of those humans that's, just so special and so dedicated on, not just as a field ranger and a leader, but is truly connected to the kind of greater view of conservation. He understands, quite like you, all the bird calls. He got obsessed with birding, and he told me a story. That's actually really how he learned how to speak English. Before becoming a ranger, he could barely even understand English. And through a bird guiding book that he borrowed, he learned the birds to identify them, and their calls, but also the book helps him learn English along with training under Ruben de Kock as well. And I think one of the most special conversations I had with him was when we were driving around the reserve, and he was, explaining how the rangers and what he's doing is really this kind of final line of defense, protecting the wildlife. But in order for us to actually have a chance of preserving this stuff, there needs to be a bigger picture, and the communities need to be involved and uplifted, and there needs to be opportunities, not only in conservation for them, but just job opportunities and economic opportunities. So maybe we could shift into that a little bit more, and any of your work that's related or understanding of that, and how, what we need to do, in conservation and as a society to kind of help these communities, reach another level and be able to, have the economic means to even care about wildlife. Because it's one thing to teach people and give them the experience, which is huge, but if there's no opportunities, then it seems like it's still going to be kind of a tough sell for anyone to care beyond just providing for their own means. So I know it's a really complex conversation and topic, but I don't know if you have any inroads into that conversation that you'd like to start with.
Anton's absolutely right, and I mean, he's at the coalface, and in a strange way, he's the last line of defense, not the front line. The front line is in the communities.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the front line is, at least in the poaching sense. In the bigger combating wildlife crime sense, the biggest front line is actually in China. It's in the Shanghai wet markets, and it's in Vietnam, in the cities where the demand is. That's where the actual front line is. But in our context, closer to home, where the crime occurs, the primary crime occurs, it is in the communities. So Anton is 150% right. The reality is, the conservation sector, if you want to call it that, can create some opportunities more. The ecotourism sector, which kind of plugs into it with the safari industry, the photographic safari industry, and of course it's contentious in terms of the hunting industry. There's a lot of things that can be done to provide employment and opportunities. The more local situation is, yes, we've got to develop the rural economies. And, South Africa's history, unfortunately, it goes back to the 19th and 18th century. Once mining, gold and diamonds were discovered, that changed everything. Completely changed everything. Suddenly, the demand for labor, which has actually embedded itself culturally in the very root of our Shangaan, Tsonga, Siswati, Pedi, Venda, Setswana communities, and where I come from, the Zulu communities, is still very much there. That migrating out of the rural areas to the big cities to look for work. And similarly to America, by comparison, we have a similar problem with a major illegal migration of people from outside of South Africa into South Africa, because we kind of, yes, we're limping along, but we're still realistically the only economic powerhouse of sorts regionally. So we've also got that happening. And, we've got Mozambicans trying to get in, and, for all the right reasons. As you mentioned, it's about livelihoods. They want to make a difference to their family back home. They're willing to take the risk. I mean, if you really think about it, to walk through a big five area, hundreds of kilometers, avoid and evade field rangers and law enforcement and police officials to come and find an illegal job to feed your family back home and still find a way of getting the money or whatever back. So from the human dimension, I have huge respect for the communities, because we have to. The solution mixes, you've got to look at the landscape. So when I say the landscape, not just the Kruger National Park and the private reserves, we have to look at the other land uses that are compatible. The wildlife economy, more holistic ways of herding, grazing, livestock, entrepreneurship, small company development, services within, and obviously the big elephant in the room in South Africa is the state and the performance of the state. And that's kind of where many of us kind of go, the state is not really enabling this. And there's a lot of focus, and I think it happens in America a lot too, in the UK. The cities get the metropolitan areas get the biggest slice of the federal and state pies and everything. And that is, to be honest, a global challenge. I think world over. You see it in China. The coastal belt is highly developed. The inland of China is very poor. So you kind of see, it's interesting. You can see these similarities in many ways. But the solution is that part of it is about creating the enabling conditions for business development to happen, and being realistic as well. You can't have conservation everywhere. There has to be other forms of economic activity. And I'm not saying you turn all these areas on the border of Kruger into big cities and factories and all that. Not saying it, but if you don't actually ask the questions first, what are the possibilities for some kind of socioeconomic development that is, as far possible, conservation friendly, or at least conservation neutral. And I think the wildlife economy definitely is presenting those opportunities where, and people might view this as crazy, what I'm saying now, but the opportunity for communities to have a stake in venison enterprises that process venison, because the world is looking at alternatives to typical proteins. How do we plug them in to those kind of markets where actually they have a stake in literally supplying the steak, but this one is from a blue wildebeest or something like that.
Yeah. Do you think a lot of this goes, at least locally, goes back to the trust issue and creating that trust? Because I feel like that's potentially where, there's still a lot of separation. I feel like there's a lot of amazing people doing work in this area, and that's kind of the future, but a lot of separation in terms of the people that are actually operating these lodges and reserves, and then the communities. And it's kind of goes back to this trust issue of creating pathways almost for, people in the communities to actually take ownership of different parts of the reserve, maybe lodges, maybe, like you're saying, different businesses, venison, things like that. So I don't know, maybe more of what's actually happening in terms of building that trust, but I feel like that might be an area where that needs more growth.
Yeah, I mean, it's an area that needs a lot of action. I think the downside of the safari industry particularly has been a kind of initial agreement. So Pinda as a model has been incredible, where they've really worked on a partnership view with the three primary communities that actually now own a portion of Pinda through a land claim and restitution process. But interestingly, the relationship is so good, the trust is so good and so robust that the community said, no, we don't want to convert this land to livestock use or drop fences and actually make your reserve smaller and take back our land. They've gone the other way around. And I think that's the thing, is you need practical examples, because what you were saying earlier is really important. Like if people can't get opportunities, our default is we want something tangible, whether it's food to feed our family or water for them to drink or shelter. It's a good old Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The more aspirational, discretionary things that are higher up that hierarchy, you start to forget about because we're not interested, because if you can't deal with the day-to-day survival or livelihoods issues and capabilities in your life, your personal life, your family life, that's a biggie. So building trust, there are some great working examples of it. I do think the safari industry overall needs a shake-up because it's very personality driven. That's the reality. It's very personality driven. People believe in their lodges. They believe in their safari product. Mm-hmm. It's theirs. It's their land. And, when you think of those things, property rights, yeah. So you can hear the pause there. That is a biggie that will have to be addressed.
Yeah, I feel like maybe it's something we could do with this film too. It's always been something kind of on my mind is, I think the bigger picture is you could have that feeling about your lodge and property and stuff like that. But ultimately, if these things don't change, that it doesn't matter how much you care about it, it's going to be taken over whether you want it or not, just by the social economic forces that are kind of moving in that direction. So bringing that awareness and trying to, it's great, like you mentioned, Pinda, and finding these other examples of people that are doing it right and using that as kind of a guiding light for other lodges and organizations, and maybe even creating ways that people that are going to go to South Africa or other African countries can use those as the standard and, have ways for them to kind of discern whether the place they're going is actually living up to those standards. I think that could potentially be something powerful too.
And you've hit on it very well. And Beyond sells that. So from a business marketing, safari kind of marketing thing, that message is very embedded. The concept of a traveler versus a tourist. And when you spend your travel dollars or pounds or euros or rands, you're actually spending it on something that has impact beyond the rate you're paying per night for your safari and everything. That it's going into a bigger value system. The thing is, it's inclusion. You have to, the best practice at its simple is that you have to include the communities formally. It's not so easy because there are power plays, who in the community benefits up in the upper ranks, respecting the tribal leadership. How does that all work? And there have been some, sadly, there have been some steps backward with that kind of thing in the past, where a good deal's made on the surface and it looks very inclusive, but only 4 or 5 people out of 50,000 are benefiting, and all the money is going that way. So, yeah, it does take quite a lot. But having said that, South Africa's on a trajectory now where, like you said, it will be forced upon, and there will be some reserves that the owners just won't buy in. And it's a farmer. Sometimes if you treat a reserve owner, a private reserve owner, like a farmer, many are highly territorial about their land. They feel that connection. They feel that that's theirs, and they've invested, particularly multi-generational reserves that have been in families for a long time. So that is a challenge. It is a big challenge, but I suspect the opportunities, and even the Kruger's trying to create more opportunities through these kind of socioeconomic nodes just outside, where they're trying to integrate communities more. And if we look at other models, so that's the Kruger. If you look at other models like Limpopo National Park on just across the border from us, and up in Tanzania and other parts of Mozambique, and the Zambian game conservation area concept, and some of the Namibian community-owned lands and preserves or reserves, there are various models that can work and have worked. They're never perfect. I think people always want they want the Rolls Royce up front, and that's kind of the point I'm also getting to. It's also work in progress. Pinde itself was set up by a whole lot of old stock farms and pineapple farms, and fences had to be dropped in, and took a few years and everything. And it went through an evolution, and eventually it started addressing the land claim thing when it started becoming pertinent, where they had a partnership already with the communities, but the communities were saying, okay, it is a question of now the land as well, and we need to be better invested with you. And I'm not necessarily saying financially, but you've also got to appeal to that. And Pinde did a great job with providing bursaries for students to go to varsity and then return and actually work at Pinde in their holidays and kind of get involved with no commitment from, not lack of commitment from Pinde, but Pinde wasn't kind of, okay, now, we paid for your education, now you committed to us for a period of time. No, they did it hoping that those students would then become the agents of change back in the communities after exposure. And I think that's a big thing, is that education is a long game as well. Yeah. Our ranger training is short and compressed and can get people into the system. But like the demand issue in Southeast Asia, the education thing is a long game. And if you don't invest in that now, which is also part of getting to your question again about what are some of the solutions, is that we've also got to have people skilled as well as motivated to try things out in the communities, to take the risk as well. And then the other thing, my big bugbear, and I've said it a few times, and maybe I'm being a bit naive, but if banks and loan institutions don't start looking at how they can invest and support at-risk small businesses in rural areas and take some of that risk, that seed capital that's needed for the smaller businesses never happens. And we've got that's a perennial challenge. There's been some very interesting models and examples from India with microloans, women-led loan groups in East Africa, if I remember correctly, and in South Africa. But still, it's kind of how to get it to scale, those practical examples. So we need some decent successes that are noticeable along the Kruger border, more practically, where people can go, aha, this makes sense, and we can support it. And I think then you get the next stage. Then people who might be initially nervous of getting involved say, okay, I will support success. I won't necessarily start success, if that makes sense, but I'll invest in the next stage.
Yeah, you need those trailblazers to go in first. And
exactly,
it's the same in like technology. No one wants to take on this new thing until all of a sudden it starts blowing up and then everyone's jumping on board. But I feel like, Ash, you've laid out kind of just a wide array of different issues and ways that things could change for the better. But I feel like, as someone listening to this, maybe in Europe or the US or somewhere else in the world, I guess, I think a lot of people coming to this podcast will be, connected to conservation or interested in it in some way. But even for the people that aren't, maybe you could start out, and you talked a little bit about your connection earlier on, but why does saving these spaces and species matter, one? And then what can we do to get involved? Because it does seem extremely complex and nothing is for sure, I guess, but there's also, just from this conversation, potentially a lot of different, so many different ways you could get involved potentially. So yeah, if you can kind of take that from why it's important and how people could potentially get involved.
Okay. At its simplest, conservation matters because of the wild places, of what it offers us, or where we come from as humanity, and what it can do, not just for us economically. And I know we've touched a lot on that, but we've spent a lot of time as a human civilization, without being too philosophical about it, in this role of being the dominant species. And, like 7 billion of us on the planet. And it's become more and more apparent, I think, and even COVID has shown it as well, is that just not being able to go outside your apartment in a lockdown in some cities of the world, or leave your space, has just shown how mental health and wellness and the power of healing. And nature offers us so many things. Some we can't actually see, that are not quantifiable, but just spending time in your park at home. You can think about just being out of your corporate job and enjoy a green space. And there are lots of studies that have shown the benefit of that. And so for our own health, our own growth, and our ability to also to switch off, we need conservation, both as an activity, but we need that wildness. We need the beauty of it. And it's interesting just how much we celebrate it when we do, whether it's a beach, when you go on holiday, and yes, there could be thousands of people there, but you're appreciating nature at that moment. If you're an adventure sports person, snowboarding, all of that, these are all connected to nature in some way. And maybe it's not always obvious, but that's what makes it really, really important.
I was just thinking the other day, sorry to interrupt, but I feel like politically there's a lot of wealthier people that are maybe don't think it's as serious of a thing to care about, like climate change and things like that. Maybe not nature in particular, but then you also see where are all the big beautiful homes. They're in these amazing wild places, maybe secluded from everyone else. So it seems a little bit like a contradiction. And I'm not putting everyone that's wealthy in that bucket, for sure. There's tons of people that are trying to do good and think conservation and wildlife and nature is worth saving. But yeah, it was just an interesting thing that I'd noticed the other day and thought I'd throw in there.
Yeah, you can see often those choices that people make in terms of if they are in that top 1% of high net worth individuals, they often make choices that isolate themselves from humanity, but deepen their connections to their sense of not necessarily owning a space, but having access to a space. And I think that's one of the other growing things of why we need conservation and wild spaces, because it's not just for the wealthy, it's for the day-to-day worker, it's for the guys and girls slogging in offices. Even if they just get to a wild place once a year, or go for a hike, get involved in an Audubon bird watching society and contribute, that gives them something tangible and everything. So conservation is for everybody. It has to be.
I'm so glad you brought that up, that perspective, because there's a lot of other arguments for why it's important between like biodiversity and, like you were saying, potential medicinal things, and just the interconnectedness of the entire world and species and nature. But that's something I think a lot of people forget, is just like what it means to be in nature. And even for myself, I journal every night, and a lot of time I'll just try to write a little memory of something that stood out in the day. And most of my days are pretty routine right now, but a lot of times the thing that'll stand out is the way the sun came through the trees when I went on a walk through the park. So it's something that's just at a deeper level that maybe we don't consider, but I think it would be a huge loss for our deeper humanity and connection to where we've come from.
Absolutely. And with that, I often get a sense, in my experience, that with that connection to nature, you become better with other people. Your relationships, like you said, now, incredibly important, your ability to reflect, be more in touch with yourself. The nature provides that grounding. The exposure in nature provides that grounding to take you out of maybe a part of your daily grind, where suddenly you're able to pull out a bit because you're experiencing something very different. And that's where I feel sad for many people, in the world globally where they don't get a chance. As you mentioned, kids in some of the local communities in this region live right next door to the Kruger, but never have gone in, those kind of things. And we have to address that. That is one of the grand challenges in the world. The existential kind of things, which, yes, those are critically important. Ecosystem integrity, protecting water catchments, looking after the species of large animals that have a direct role in how ecosystems function and how those ecosystems contribute to our existence. So I think I don't want to talk about that too much because, climate change debates and the bigger biodiversity loss stuff already talk about the existential threat. If we don't start addressing those things, I think that's quite obvious, but sometimes, and I think this is part of the problem with it, it's so overwhelming and people kind of either freeze, pause, or eventually it's just too big, too scary of a thought. And I think RHINO Man also provides a very practical, and that's what I really like about RHINO Man, is it provides a very practical set of insights. Getting back to your other question, say, how can I get involved in conservation? There's an interest in conservation for everybody. It's not just this amorphous thing. It's not just this thing in the air. I would encourage the listeners to this to say, hey, investigate something that interests you around conservation. It's also whether you love fish, the ocean, big game, wide rolling plains, mountains. If you are a snowboarder, think about how you can give back to the place that you go snowboarding, if it's in a national park or a preserve or something like that. And that also addresses the other part, is that you can give back. You can pay it forward in the now, make a difference in the now. Whether you choose it as a career and you work in conservation as a person every day, or if you do it as somebody who contributes to an NGO or a nonprofit or some kind of cause. And I think we're moving into the era of trying to provide value. And value can be done from a computer, at home, in a different country. And I think that's also the important thing about what RHINO Man is offering, is to show a real human story within a conservation story, and show people, hey, it is possible. It's not just, you can pay your monthly fee to the Audubon Society, or you can get more involved. You can, like yourself, kind of make time to get out and about and enjoy green spaces. And that's something I learned about birding, getting back into my past, is I could do it in an urban garden at home. Might not see a lot, but I could take time to focus on nature, even in its simplest form. And I think that's the big thing is conservation, biodiversity, and we've actually, in a strange way, have hardly spoken about rhino. But when we think about poaching and wildlife crime, these are all real threats to the very things that can bring us great joy, great connections, improve our personal health, how we view the world, and also, a little bit naive here maybe, but a little bit of selflessness in a way, that you can leave a little part of yourself and make a difference. And I'm a firm believer. I've been in the game a long time and I'm still passionate about it. And that's kind of the thing to say, guys, you can get jaded by life. Nature can help you get past some of being jaded and those kind of things about, where am I going in my career and all of that. So, yeah, I know it's a big thing. To get back to your one part of that question, although the challenges are complex, there are components to those challenges, and you can get involved in trying to address a component. Yeah. So if you love dogs, you want to support an anti-poaching canine unit, support it. Nobody's asking anybody to take on the whole thing. Like myself, it's a massive set of things. But what we can do is help each other in different ways, support certain people who are working on another component, which is why I support GCC and RHINO Man and you guys, because you're trying to tackle one of the components that I'm not necessarily tackling, or colleagues and friends of mine are not necessarily tackling. And I think it's about being discerning and taking time to think about it. And when I say think about it, see where you can make a difference. And I think once you get the bite, you kind of take that bite and you leap in it, but then the possibilities are endless. I've seen people do very little things and then suddenly, oh, actually, I can make a difference.
Sure. I feel like that's kind of my story, to be honest. I mean, I came to RHINO Man as, wow, this looks like a really interesting project. People are doing cool things in the world. I'd love to work with these guys. And then a year later, I would kind of took the lead of the project and was in South Africa shooting, more stuff, and just got more and more involved. And as a filmmaker, just coming to it from wanting to create a great story and connecting with these humans. Yeah, you never know where life will take you and how you'll get connected and how it'll draw you in more and more. But, and I think, like, going back to what you were saying about making a difference and what that can do, I think just in your own life, whatever that is you're connected to, I think that's one of the big messages of RHINO Man, is seeing these humans. Like, even if you're not interested in conservation, I think watching people that are extremely passionate about making a difference in the world and dedicating their lives to that is really inspiring. And no matter what you're doing in the world, I think there's a lot of those types of heroes in conservation that are putting their lives towards a bigger purpose. And it's pretty inspiring story. But I feel like we've gone a little long here, so I want to try and wrap us up. Maybe to finish off a little bit lighter, we can kind of just briefly go over your birding experience a little more, because you kind of brought that back up as, a way to get connected. And you could do that pretty much anywhere. There's, beautiful bird species all over the world. Of course, South Africa is got to be one of the best places to do it for sure. That's where I started to get into it. And maybe you can go a little bit more into what that experience is like. What, for me, I'd like to hear the way you talk about it, but I didn't get anywhere close to the level of birding capabilities that you're at. But just even once you kind of start to get a novice grasp of it, it's suddenly, when you walk outside, it goes from like standard def to high def is kind of how I think of it. Because what once used to be this kind of just general background noise, all of a sudden you, like, in your mind, you're seeing these different species of birds as you're hearing them in these different areas, which, depending on times of year, can mean different things, or their connection to, if you really want to go deeper, the, greater kind of ecology and, trees and landscapes and what species come in for those things. So yeah, just from your perspective, what attracted you to birding, and maybe talk a little bit about the levels that you've gone up, because you're, from what I understand, one of the top birders in South Africa, maybe the world. I don't know. You're high up there.
No, thanks. Not quite, but yeah. I mean, I had a head start, of course, at everything, and that kind of, you go through the phases of childhood and teenage and adulthood and everything. And I, as I mentioned, the bug got bitten very quickly, and I kind of really embraced it, because it does, and you picked up on it brilliantly, it does change the way you interpret and sense things, your level of awareness. And that's one of the very practical things about working in conservation or supporting conservation and being, like in my case, a birder. You could be a butterfly person. You could be a indigenous tree person, a plant person. It's all very similar, because what it does, in a sense, is it motivates you to see more. Therefore, you go out into nature more. You start looking around more. You start being more aware of what's happening. And then you start learning. And that learning bit is about, hang on, at this time of the year, these flowers are flowering and these sunbirds are coming in to feed and actually pollinating. And you start building kind of a knowledge, working practical knowledge. And it doesn't have to be hugely scientific. In the case of field guides and rangers, if you don't take your cues from certain birds in the bush, you could get yourself into trouble with a large animal because you've got to be paying attention and everything. So what I learned about birding in myself is I'm often operating at a certain level, and then a little bit deeper, I'm operating another level where even if I'm talking and engaging people, I can hear a bird call or hear something, and then I'll be able to move over and switch over to that and go, wow, that's that. Or if I don't want to be rude and don't know the people really well, but I'm still listening and I'm picking up on something, that's just like a hidden story about me. I'm often, people say you can't multitask. It's probably true, but I'm multitasking, listening in the background and everything. And I mean, it's very much part of my identity because, yeah, there will be times when you won't see lots of mammals. There will be times when things are quiet. And birding is just something you can travel the world, see different birds, as you said. I've done a bit of that, done a lot of that into Africa, and it's given purpose to getting out there and enjoying it. And it's also, bird identification can be very challenging. Some of us are better with calls, others are better with visual identification. It's a mix. In my life, I've been very, very, very blessed and fortunate to be able to use the opportunities that my work presented to be able to bird. And I'll admit it, sometimes I'm on safari and I'd have very big five oriented guests, but slowly but surely I would introduce birds into the conversation just to test the waters. And sometimes, wow, then they would stop paying attention, thinking, wow, these hornbills are crazy. They would stop saying, okay, actually, let's stop for a picture. I want to actually get one. And then you start influencing how people see the world. So from a guiding perspective, and of course, then there are others who would not be interested, and we would find a pride of lions sleeping. And so I would be sitting there with the guests that I would be birding, not necessarily lifting up my binoculars, but I'd be listening out to bird calls and things like that.
I feel like that happens to me a bit. I mean, it's, I think when you first come to Africa, you want to see the big five and all this stuff. But, after you see so many elephants and lions, the birds just offer so many more opportunities. And there's, such a diversity of birds just from, visually what they look like to the calls and everything. So it just adds a whole nother level. And then when you go on a game drive, there's so much more to be looking for and noticing. So yeah, it's a really great way to just kind of connect yourself even more to nature and things around you. And maybe in like the techie terms, almost like gamify the experience, which, it goes, like you said, one thing to the next. You start learning a few calls and then their connections to the wildlife around you. And it's just kind of a interesting and exciting way to gain more knowledge about nature through something that seems, maybe simple or silly at first, but suddenly it almost becomes like collecting something. You're like collecting these experiences and sightings. And
yeah, I mean, you could go like so many things. You can be completely obsessed, and I went through phases of that where you'd hear that some rare bird is pitched up in Durban or something, and I would book a flight and fly down and join a group of birders, and we'd go and look for this rare bird. But I've kind of come back to kind of several lessons in life about just enjoying it. And I've already noticed that it's not so much the volume. I spend more time watching their behavior, seeing the little things that they do, and not just ticking them off for the day and things like that. And I mean, there's so many great little stories unfolding in nature all the time if you pay attention. And you might not necessarily fully understand. Nobody expects that. But if you take the time, it might stir your curiosity, like it did for me as a child. You kind of become a bit curious, and I had a good mentor, my grandfather, and my dad as well. It's like, okay, pay attention to this and just watch what that bird is doing. There's a nest. And so the story builds, and your narrative and your enjoyment can build. Because, human beings by nature, we like to see new and different things. And birding, I think, does offer that. You can enjoy a safari experience in Africa, for example. Come year one, do all the big stuff. Year two, still be very keen on the big stuff, but then you start kind of letting yourself soak up some of this. So I've seen some crazy stuff with birds. I've seen really crazy. I once witnessed a crowned hawk eagle or crowned eagle at Pinda once kill a pair of them, hunt into a troop of vervet monkeys. And one got one of the monkeys. The female managed to get in, and flying low was stalking like a lion would, moving from tree to tree, but landing and then hiding and looking around and stalking closer and closer. And it was incredible. I've got this memory. I'll never forget it. And eventually the final dive in, and the monkey scattered, but the eagle managed to get this adult monkey. And we were close enough. It sounds awful, but we could hear the spine being snapped. And that was a monkey died. And I was just flabbergasted. It blew my mind. Like, we grow up on maybe seeing David Attenborough productions where you see cheetah across the plains of Africa, chasing Thompson's gazelles or something like this. This was on bird terms, to see a stalk and kill by this large, powerful eagle. That's probably one of my most amazing memories.
That sounds like an amazing sighting. And I think maybe a great way to kind of end the conversation. It's the beauty and the terror in some ways for the monkeys, especially of nature. But yeah, thank you so much, Ash, for this conversation. I feel like we've covered so much ground, and your depth and knowledge of the situation has been just a great way to kind of get some more understanding of the complexity and the opportunities as well of ways to get involved. Just to kind of finish up, where could people follow you or kind of see what you're doing, moving on in the future if they care to?
I'm on LinkedIn as well. So they can just type in Ashwell Glasson. There's very few of us in the world. I don't think there is another one on LinkedIn. So they can find me on LinkedIn, and I kind of share there, a bit on Instagram, which is obviously more about pics, and I do take a few pics, of stuff that I see, whether it's views and mountains and the bush and animals and things like that, and just quiet time in the bush that I enjoy. Facebook as well. Also just type in my name. There I kind of do friend people and post a lot there. Obviously, just so everybody understands, I also operate with a bigger view because of the wildlife crime component. So I also kind of keep in touch with issues of insurgency and terror-related poaching, which is unfortunately seems to be growing. So when you see some of my social media stuff, you will see a security and wildlife crime and insurgency kind of component to it, because that's part of the complexity that we face.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I feel like it's always a great way for me to kind of keep in touch with what's going on over there. You have a wide ranging view and perspective and connection for the problems and issues. And you post a lot of positive things too, and some beautiful poetry and pictures and stuff. So yeah, it's not all, tough things that are happening. So appreciate that as well. But yeah, Ash, thank you so much again. It really wonderful to have you on the show. Maybe we'll do another conversation at another time. I feel like we could talk for hours.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. Really appreciate it, John.
Thank you for listening to the RHINO Man podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you're excited to see the film succeed, please subscribe and review our podcast on Spotify and iTunes. Then follow us on Instagram and Facebook at RHINO Man the Movie. More details about Rhino Man, the Social Impact Campaign, and future screenings are at rhinomanthemovie.org. To learn more about the Global Conservation Corps and their work, visit globalconservationcorps.org. Sign up for the newsletter and follow GCC on all of the social platforms. If you like this podcast, make sure to subscribe and catch up on GCC's Voices of Nature podcast, where Bob Ludke interviews a wide range of people who have dedicated their lives to making a difference in conservation. A special thanks goes out to Simone Wilson for the music for this podcast. He's the brilliant composer for Rhino Man the movie. Learn more about his work at simonewilsonmusic.com. Until next time, I'm John Jerko, and this is the Rhino Man Podcast.